Welcome everyone. This is the session on moving beyond survival, strategic planning for nonprofits using balanced scorecard. And I am Becky Roberts, and I am a consultant who's been doing balanced scorecard for many years, doing strategic planning with a variety of nonprofits. I got invited to come speak today because I worked with a very small nonprofit called All Ages Read Together in Loudoun County, Virginia, and did a little bit of pro bono work with them on balanced scorecard, and they found it useful, and they said, hey, why don't you come and speak? So that's why I'm here. We have a fairly small group, and I want to encourage this to be as useful to you as it can be, so feel free to ask questions, to post questions in the Q&A in Whova. We have two moderators helping us today, Britt Ackus and Beverly Lehman, and they will be monitoring the chat and such. So feel free, and they should catch things if I miss them. And I will add, please have patience with technology. It's not working exactly as it did when we did the dry run, so hopefully it'll all work, and we'll see how it goes. Next slide. So as you start to think about, how do you stay focused in the pandemic, and how do you keep your organization working, like an effective machine and getting things done, this cartoon sort of represents my view of the way we're all feeling in the pandemic. We've got so many things going on. We've got all of these distractions, and then you add, next slide, and then you add the pandemic on top of it, and it's very hard to really stay focused on, how do you really serve your constituents? How do you move your organization forward? How do you maintain your funding streams? All of that. And so that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. Next slide. So we have two polls here in Whova, and I encourage you to go there and fill out the poll and look at the responses. First poll is, does your organization have a strategic plan? And your options, and actually I'm looking in Whova, and I think they're backwards, but it doesn't matter. Does your organization have a strategic plan? Not yet, or I sort of have a plan, but it's in my head, or it's obsolete. We have one that sits on the shelf and it's not being implemented. Provides useful guidance to us and keeps us focused. That's kind of where you want to be. And actually, I am not figuring out a way to see the responses to the poll. Britt or Beverly, can you get to the responses to the poll? Can you unmute yourself and help us out there? Okay, you have to answer it in order. I've got it. So our answers are, we've got a couple of people who are not yet, or it's in their head. That's about half of the responses, and the other half of the responses provides useful guidance that keeps us focused. So we've got kind of both ends of the spectrum in the group. Britt, if we can go to the next slide. Which is the second poll, which actually in Whova is the first poll. how has the pandemic impacted your organization's ability to deliver results? And we've got a sort of a scale here from significant negative impact through to no impact to a to positive impact. If you all can answer that. And so looking at the answers that have come in so far, it's mostly negative impact, somewhat negative or significant negative. So, you know, we're in an environment, you know, even if you have a strategic plan that you're working against, then something like the pandemic comes in and impacts that. Okay, next slide. So what we're going to do today is we are going to talk a little bit about balanced scorecard. I'm going to introduce the basic framework, and we're going to talk about how to use it to develop actionable goals. And we're going to talk about how balanced scorecard can be used to help you stay focused, if you will, in that crazy world where things are changing. Next slide. So here's our agenda, little introduction. We're going to talk about the balanced scorecard. We are going to do an exercise, and we're going to split that into two pieces. If we have time, we're going to talk a little bit about strategy mapping, which is a component of the balanced scorecard that allows you to really look at cause and effect relationships. So, so that's what we're going to do today. Next slide. Okay, before we get into the meat of it, just a little housekeeping things. If you have questions, absolutely, please, we want you to ask them. You can put them in the app under Q&A. Britt and Beverly, if you have technology problems or challenges, you can chat or message to Britt or Beverly for technical support. And I appreciate it for those of you who have put your cameras on. It's always nice to be able to feel like I'm talking to an audience, and that helps. And I encourage you, particularly, we're going to use some breakouts. When you're in breakouts, turn your cameras on so that you can be talking with your group. Okay, next slide. All right, so we have all these crazy things going on that are competing for our attention. We are wrestling with trying to meet the needs of funders and the people our nonprofit is serving, and all of these things. And then next slide. And then again, the pandemic hits and it changes everything. It may change your access to funding. It may change the processes you use for funding. It may change what your constituents need. It may change how your workforce comes into play. And so how do you really deal with that? So next slide. So the balanced scorecard is a strategic management system. And that's important because it's not just a way to put together a plan. It's truly a way to manage your strategy. And it gives you a holistic view of your organization and what you're trying to achieve. And this little diagram here, you have your vision and strategy in the middle, and then typically the balanced scorecard has 4 perspectives: financial, customer, internal business process, and learning and growth. And the idea is that those should be in balance. So you got to keep your eye on all of them at once. And that's why it's viewed as a holistic system. It's tied to business objectives. So in each of these areas, you define business objectives, and then it gives you a way to keep your eye on those. And you can, it's non-proprietary, you can totally adapt it to your needs. So that, for instance, there are these 4 perspectives that are standard. You can tailor the perspectives, you can add perspectives. When I work with commercial organizations, sometimes they want to add something separate around business development. When I work with nonprofits and government, often the customer perspective becomes something other than customer. It becomes constituent, it becomes citizen, it becomes whoever is sort of the key stakeholder that you're focusing on and providing services to. You will see as we move into this that the balanced scorecard is focused on defining your strategy, but then translating that strategy into actionable initiatives. I just saw a question popped up. Will you send copies of the slides? Absolutely. Actually, they are in the app already. If you scroll down on the app, you see the video feed of this session. If you scroll down below that, you will see there are two attachments. I should have mentioned this in the housekeeping. There are two attachments. One is the slides, and the other one is a template or a worksheet that we're going to use in the exercises. So feel free to go ahead and download those. So balanced scorecard is a tool to drive change, and this is an important point because the only reason to do strategic planning is if you want something different than what you have today. If everything is just absolutely perfect the way it is working today, then you really don't need a plan, because the plan is for what are we going to do different in the future. It may include what are we going to keep doing, but ultimately the idea of having a plan is to get to somewhere different than you are. And so that's the focus. And then the other piece is that it can be a foundation for recognition and rewards. You can cascade the scorecard all the way down to individual people and say, okay, here's what, if this is what our organization is trying to achieve, then how do these people, how do these teams contribute to achieving that? And then let's recognize and reward them. And that may be at your awards banquet when you are thanking funders for having made it possible for you to achieve things. It may be looking at your staff or your volunteers who have made a particular difference. But if you do it from a balanced scorecard framework, you're doing it looking at not just, oh, they were nice and lovely and they put in lots of hours, but, oh, they really helped us achieve this result for our customers. Next slide. So for those of you who care, to give you a little history of the balanced scorecard and where it come from, in 1990, Robert Kaplan and David Norton did a study that was looking at the inadequacy of financial measures to adequately reflect the health of an organization. So you think about that. You can be making money hand over fist, but if your product is obsolete, you may be out of business next year. They then published 3 articles in Harvard Business Review. In '92, it was an article about having a balanced set of performance measures, which at the time was not a very radical idea, but they really articulated it in a very crisp, clear way in their article. In '93, they did an article that talked about actually tying those performance measures to your strategic goals, which isn't a real radical idea, but if you're going to have performance measures, they ought to measure the things that you said were important. And then in '96, they published an article that said, well, gosh, if you're doing that, then you can actually use it as an entire management system to manage your strategy. They've published a ton of articles since then. They've published a ton of books. If you really want to read anything, I'd say read those first 3 articles. They were much better than subsequent stuff, in my view. Next slide. So if you don't remember anything else, this is the guts of balanced scorecard. You have 4 perspectives and you're asking the question. So if we start with financial, to succeed financially, how do we appear to our shareholders or funders? And you have goals or objectives, you have performance measures, you have targets, and you have initiatives. So, how do we need to appear to our funders? You have internal business process to satisfy our shareholders, our funders, our stakeholders. At what processes do we need to really excel at? Which are the things that we need to do exceptionally well, not just adequately, but exceptionally well. Customer, who is our customer? And to achieve our vision and mission, how do we need to appear to them? what is it that we need to be providing them? How do we need to appear to them? And again, what are the goals, measures, targets, initiatives for that? And then learning and growth, which is a kind of a funny label. It's essentially about how do we sustain our ability to change and improve in the future. It's about infrastructure, whether it's human capital, physical infrastructure, technology. What are the things that we need to have in place in order to do those business processes, in order to serve our constituents, in order to get the funding that we need? And we have a question here about a technology problem. Maybe Britt or Beverly, you can help Nancy there.
I'm back again. I'll get to the questions now.
Okay. Next slide. So what is balanced scorecard really? So years ago, I was asked to come into the Navy and train an executive officer in balanced scorecard. I was given 45 minutes to do it. And about 20 minutes into it, he stopped me and he said, well, so do I understand this right, that what you're talking about is common sense and good management? And my answer to him was yes, but you never would have invited me in to teach you common sense and good management. So there's nothing radical or new or different about this. But as we know, common sense and good management is easy to say and sometimes hard to do. So, if it feels simple and straightforward, that means you're beginning to get it. Next slide. Okay, so this is the way it comes together as a strategic management system. You have your vision and your mission and your customer. Who is your customer and what are you providing to them? You then define your value proposition, which is what's the unique value that we bring to this situation. Why us? What are we really doing for the customer? And then you have a very high level strategy that's focused on, if that's the unique value we're giving to our customer, how is it we're doing it? And then you peel that down and you say, okay, well, if that's our strategy, our general big picture strategy, what are our goals and objectives to make that happen? What performance measures are we going to use to measure whether we're doing that? What are the initiatives, projects, activities that it takes to make it happen? And then how do those pieces interact? And the strategy map defines the cause and effect relationships that say, well, if we do this, then this will happen. That will enable us to do this, which will enable us to serve our customer. And so that's how the whole thing fits together. And so now we're going to sort of step through some of those pieces. Next slide. So the value proposition answers the question of what's your unique value to whoever it is you've defined as being your customer. And I like using Costco as an example. Now, this is not Costco's official thing. This is Becky's view of Costco. My view is that Costco's value proposition, what makes Costco unique, is that it provides consistently solid quality at a competitive price to customers who have little time to shop around, right? So if I can walk into Costco, I feel like, well, if it's in Costco, it's probably pretty good. I can just buy it and not have to shop around, not have to worry about anything. Your value proposition might be about providing a particular service to a constituency in your community. Nordstrom's, for instance, used to be known for customer service, right? You didn't shop at Nordstrom because it was low price. You didn't shop at Nordstrom because it had anything unique available. You shopped there because it was known for customer service. Personally, I think that's why they're maybe in trouble, is that they're no longer known for customer service. Okay, next slide. So then you have, once you've gotten clear on that value proposition, what's the unique thing you're doing for your constituency? Then the question is, how do you deliver that? And for Costco, my example here, when I thought about it, it seems like, well, okay, they've got a basic operational excellence strategy of using bulk purchasing power, knowledgeable buyers, and a well-managed warehouse store to obtain high-quality products that can be sold at a pretty low price. And you think about that. If that's their strategy, you can start to imagine how you could start then writing goals around all of that. For instance, if knowledgeable buyers are important, well, how on earth what would they have to do to be sure that their buyers are knowledgeable? You know, what do they have to do to ensure that they have bulk purchasing power? So getting clear on what you're really providing to your customers and what your unique approach is to providing it is important. Next slide, please. So then, having gotten clear on what your strategy is, you then want to figure out, okay, well, what are the perspectives we're going to use? And you want to define goals and objectives within those perspectives. And so Balanced Scorecard gives you the 4 standard perspectives: customer, which comes from that, which ties back to the value proposition; the internal business process, which ties back to the strategy; learning and growth, which can tie back to the strategy as well; and financial. But you may want to tailor those perspectives. So for instance, your customer, you may decide that customer isn't a term that resonates in your organization. And it may be constituent or beneficiary or person served or community or whatever. You may want to, learning and growth sometimes seems like a gobbledygook term to people. And so sometimes that they change that to resources or infrastructure or, you know, so it can be, you know, financial could be changed to fundraising if you wanted, or funding or whatever. But so you figure out what perspectives you're going to use, and then you define goals and objectives within those perspectives. And let's go to the next slide. So one of the things, if you go back and read the various articles and read the books and stuff, one of the things you will see is that there's a tendency to use the term objective. I tend to use the term goal. If you look it up in the dictionary, a goal is something to be achieved or worked towards. And then the next definition will say a goal is an objective. And if you look up objective in the dictionary, it will say the definition of an objective is a goal. So they're sort of interchangeable. Often in strategic planning, people use them to define a hierarchy of high level versus next level. In Balanced Scorecard, I have a tendency, I must say, I have a tendency to use the terms interchangeably. But so the idea is you want to define the results that you need to support your mission, and you want to write them with an action verb, a measurable outcome, or the result you're trying to achieve. And then typically, if you were doing regular, if you will, strategic planning, you would want to have the goal include a time frame. So do this by then, by a particular time to achieve this result. In Balanced Scorecard, where we tend to define performance measures and then targets within a particular time frame, the measures and targets really cover the time frame. So for instance, if you're saying, okay, I have a goal to raise the money needed to support a particular program, your measure might be money raised, and your target might be, well, in 2021, I want to raise this much money. In 2022, I want to raise this much money. And in 2023, I want to raise that much money. And so the targets give you that time frame. Next slide. So again, back to those 4 perspectives, you want to define those goals. And then you define the measures and the targets. And then you define okay, well, if we want to raise this much money by this time frame, what's the initiative we're going to use to do that? Are we going to have a fundraising campaign? Are we going to have an event? Are we going to increase membership? Or, what are we going to do? And so that's the basic framework. Next slide. So goals should be SMART. And by SMART, SMART is a framework that's been around for forever, it seems like. They should be specific, they should be measurable, they should be actionable or achievable, they should be realistic, and they should be time bound. And I've added to that they should not be dumb, delusional or duplicative, unlikely or unrealistic, based on mistaken information, or boundless, right? So just saying, well, we want to raise a bunch of money. Well, what does that mean? Is a bunch of money $2 or $2 million? On the other hand, if it's, we want to raise money this much by this time frame, that starts to become specific. And then you can evaluate whether that's realistic or not. If the most you've ever raised in a year is $100,000, and now you have set a goal of raising $100 million, maybe it's not realistic. So that's goals. Next slide. So here is a basic template, and this template is provided in the app down below the screen where you see the video feed. And this really is kind of the guts of Balanced Scorecard. So within each of the 4 perspectives, you would define objectives or goals. What are you trying to do and achieve? Next slide. Yeah. So what are you trying to do and achieve? And define them with an action verb and an outcome or a result. And we'll talk about the rest of it in a minute, but next slide. So what I want to do is I want to stop me talking and get you all engaged. And I'd like you all we're going to put you into breakouts. And I want you to select an organization. And that could be one of your organizations. It could be, I once did this with a nonprofit credit union, and one of the groups picked the food truck that stopped outside of their building every day. So it could be a hypothetical organization, whatever. And for that organization, think through and develop an objective for each of the 4 perspectives. And so we're going to give you about 15 minutes to do that. And remember, you want them to start with a verb and include a result. We're going to give you about 15 minutes to do that. Then we're going to come back. We're going to talk a little bit about performance measures, and we're going to put you back in the breakouts to look at measurement. So if in the process of talking about it, you have any thoughts on measurement, feel free to capture them.
Were you all able to actually have a conversation in your breakout? Maybe somebody unmute your phone and share.
Breakout 1 did, yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, breakout room 1, we had about 15 minutes where one of our members who's already, developed a pretty good plan, he was able to share with us what he did, and it was very beneficial.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Do you want to share just a quick snippet? Tell us a little bit about that.
Did he not make it back into the main section? There you are.
I'm here. From room 1. I think I'm working from my my iPhone. But anyway, I laid out our our strategic objectives, we have four primary strategic objectives. We work with middle, elementary, and high school boys to teach them to be more engaged with STEM. Also, we look at the other objective is increase their academic performance, increase their social behavior. And one of our other ones is we are dealing primarily with minority kids, expose them to positive African-American role models. I talked about our customers. We have three basic customers. We have the students, we have the community, and then we have our grant funders who fund us. And based on how we measure that effect on satisfying what they need, it varies based on the customer. I kind of talked them through some of the internal business processes that we utilize to execute the strategy. And some of those we've had to revamp because of COVID. And some of the COVID has taught us some new business practices that we'll probably, when we exit COVID, we may still employ because we found they were pretty effective. On their learning and growth, we kind of talked about the feedback loop on how you assess how you're doing with your program so that you then can make adjustments in your strategy. And the financials kind of talks about really the funding piece to allow you to do to accomplish your overall strategy. That's kind of summary without taking too long over.
Okay, excellent. And on learning and growth, probably one of your real issues is how do you attract those role models, right? I don't know how they play into your program, but you have to have the good people working with your program in order to participate, right?
Well, we actually came up and created a curriculum, and the curriculum is around four tenets of manhood, scholarship, perseverance, and uplift. And so we built the curriculum, and it kind of said, okay, for this session, we do a life skill topics prior to going into robotics, because we found with the COVID and virtual, their attention span is not as long. We used to have them 3 to 4 hours a session. We found that we had to break that down to about half that time because you can see them doing other stuff and they're not paying attention. So those are some of the changes that, how do we align our curriculum to our objectives? And then we kind of look at that. Over.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Let's move on in the interest of time. Next slide. Okay. So we spent a little time talking about how you define your objectives or your goals. The next thing you want to do is you want to be able to measure those. And the basic framework in Balanced Scorecard is that you have a performance measure, and the performance measure is what you're going to measure. So that might be the number of people who have attended training or the amount of money raised or whatever. And the target is the level of performance that you want to achieve. So it might be that if your measure is number of people who attended training, your target might be 10 per month or 1,000 per year or whatever. Your targets may change over time. And so, next slide. So it might be, for instance, number of people served, and it's 50 people is your target. So, and the next year it might be 100 people. So next slide. So when we go back to the template, next. So the measure is how are you going to track success? How will we know we're done? How will we know that we've accomplished it? We are going to look at this thing, number of people served. Next. And then the target is what's that level of performance or the rate of improvement that you want over time. And so that starts to make your goal very smart. It's specific, it's measurable, it's time bound. Next. And then your initiatives are the key things that you need to actually make that happen. So that if you want to serve twice the number of people that you served last year, well, what are you going to do differently to make that happen? And, that might be outreach to new people. It might be doubling the capacity. It might be building a building in order to have the space for your program. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve. Next. Okay, so what we wanted to do was to have you then go back into your breakouts and develop performance measures and targets for at least one objective in your scorecard. And given the difficulty that we had in the breakouts and how small of a group that we've got, I'm thinking that maybe we don't do that as a breakout and instead maybe we just open the mics up and have you all talk about that a little bit. If we take Bernard's example, what would be one of the objectives that you might want to measure, and how would you do that?
One of our objectives is in improving academic performance, and so we actually, by partnering with the Charles County Science Center, we track the students' grades, and we also get feedback from we use a team of tutors that work with the boys during the weeks. So we try and get them excited about being smart, because we know the reluctance of especially minority kids in being smart sometimes is not cool. So we make a big deal out of when they get all A's or all A's and a B, as long as they are passing and they're doing their work and they're trying their best, we make a big deal out of their grades. And then we also use that to track and see a kid that was an A student, they're dropping down to a B. Why is that? What's causing that? So we use the grades as one measure of effectiveness of the program.
And so in that situation, there are a whole slew of nuances. Let's go back. There are a whole slew of nuances of what you could measure, in that you can measure the actual grade. Okay, it was an A, a B, and how many kids got A's or how many kids passed. You could also measure improvement. How many kids' grades went up at least one grade from last period to this period. You could measure how many of the kids in your program went from failing to passing. So you can really think out what's the most effective measure, and you may find that the measure that you want when you report to your funders is different from the measure that on an operational level, for instance, your tutors use, because your tutors may be looking at how did they do on the test last week, whereas when you're reporting measures to your funders, it may be, how many of the kids' grades went up, or how many of the kids went from failing to passing, or how many of the kids went from barely passing to only A's and B's. And so to think about that strategically, and the beauty of your program, Bernard, is that you have put in place the partnerships to get the data. And that's the other piece of the picture you want to think about, is because, when you think about that, well, do you really have access to the kids' grades? Well, you do. And so that's great. Okay. Let's move on. Next slide. Okay, so I said if we had time, we would talk about strategy mapping. And strategy mapping is one of the things in my mind that really starts to make the balanced scorecard powerful. And this slide is kind of the textbook slide, and then we'll talk about it on a more practical level. A strategy map gives you a one-page view of your strategy. And so you can use it to really communicate your strategy, whether that's communicating it to your team, to your staff, to your volunteers, or communicating it to the community, to funders, that kind of thing. It identifies the cause and effect relationships among your different goals and objectives so that you can then see, well, I have to do this first, because if I don't do this, then I won't be able to do this next thing. But if I do this well, for instance, if I get enough volunteers, and maybe getting adequate volunteers is part of your learning and growth objective, if I get these volunteers, then internal business process, I will be able to do training for more people, for more students, which then in the customer perspective will enable me to have more kids whose grades have gone up. And then if I have more kids whose grades have gone up, that will enable me to show the funders that we were a worthwhile investment, and it will enable me to attract more funders to get more money so I can grow the program even more. The other really cool thing about strategy mapping is that, and there's a whole process around how you do a strategy map, but it allows you to diagnose problems in your strategy. So sometimes you find, well, if I do this and then a miracle happens, we'll get to this. But if I look at my objectives and try and map them, there's no way that if I do these things, it's actually going to get me to this result, right? So, and then that says, well, gee, maybe I need to figure out something that we have to do in order to fill that gap to get us to that point. So that, for instance, if you want to train twice as many kids, put them through your program, but you have no plan for how you're going to get more kids, and your approach to how you're going to get more kids is you hope that they show up, maybe that's a gap in your strategy. And so maybe you need something around, we're going to have this outreach program, which is going to get us more kids, which will then allow us to do more training for them. And, so it can be used as a validation mechanism for your strategy. And very often when we do strategy mapping, what we find is that the strategy changes a little bit because it helps you see where the gaps are. It can also help you see what's most important. So next slide. So in my little Costco example, and remember we said that, in my view, Costco uses bulk purchasing power, knowledgeable buyers, and well-managed warehouse stores to obtain high-quality products that can be sold at or near the lowest market price. Okay, so from a learning and growth perspective, they need to maybe they have an objective about modernizing their supply chain management systems and hiring and training knowledgeable staff. If they do those two things, they can then, from their business process perspective, they can manage their stores well, and they can buy competitive goods at competitive prices, buy bulk goods at competitive prices. If they do those two things, then customers will be happy and will start to view them as a source, a good place to shop. And if their customers view them as a good place to shop and come and shop a lot, then they will make a profit for their shareholders. So the strategy mapping is about, if you will, an if-then construct. And you can do this for an individual program. You can do it for your entire organization. When you do strategy mapping, and I guess I didn't include this slide, but when you do strategy mapping for a nonprofit, very often what we end up doing is we put customer at the top of the strategy map, and we put financial and business process next to each other, still with learning and growth at the bottom. What we do not like to do is put financial at the bottom, because in my mind, that gives you the out of, it can be good, but it can also give you a victim model. It's like, we didn't get the money, therefore we couldn't hire the staff, therefore we couldn't provide the services, and therefore we didn't serve our constituency. I would rather you take ownership of the financial piece and say, okay, we hired a great fundraiser, we had a good fundraising process, which got us the money, which enabled us to serve our customer, to provide services to our community. So this can be a great way to and when you think it out, you know, can you take your strategy and describe it that way? Describe it with if we do this, we will then be able to do this, which will enable us to do that, which will enable us to do that, which will enable us to serve our mission, whatever it is in the community. Next slide. And so when you start to think it out that way, very often those objectives start to change a little bit, because you start to realize, well, maybe I didn't articulate it quite right. It needs to be a little different. Or there was something missing that I need to add, or whatever. But so it becomes an iterative process that you can then work through. And Bernard, in your example, do you feel like that's something that you would be able to do to really sort of say, okay, well, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this?
Well, what we've done is identified the number of qualified mentors, kind of my limiting factor, because I can't grow the program. You know, if I'm going to have a quality program, and we've kind of defined the student to mentor ratio is kind of a limiting factor. That's kind of where I'm limited right now on growth, unless I actually get a completely another organization that can bring their mentors with them. And so that's where we're at, as kind of an impasse as an organization, and is, you know, how do we develop new a qualified mentoring pool that will allow us to bring on more students over.
Right. So if you don't have that question addressed in your strategy, from a strategy mapping perspective, there's a gap, because and then a miracle has to happen in order for us to serve more kids. And so, you know, there are a whole slew of different approaches you could take, right? You could enter into partnerships with other organizations. You could do a whole outreach program to attract mentors. You could do, you know, but ultimately, and this is kind of an infrastructure thing, a learning and growth thing, you know, somewhere in there in your strategy, there needs to be some objective around increasing your pool of available, qualified, talented mentors. Right.
Yeah. And that led us to partnerships, because I took, you know, we had a strategy session like a year ago, and it kind of says, right now we limited our mentors to our members, because one, we know we can train them, we can get their background checks done, we know how to control that. And so, and if we don't, and so when the leadership decided we don't want to go outside of our membership to grow mentors, then that meant our strategy then for growth became aligned with partnerships and finding similar organizations that we could get to adopt our model. And that's on right now is our roadmap to growth if we're going to grow this program over.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so in summary, that value proposition defines your destination. It defines what is it you're really doing for your customer, your constituent. And, you know, Bernard, you talked about how you viewed funders as part of your customer. I would say in your situation, the kids are your real customer. I mean, the funders are important stakeholders. And you had a third group. I forget who the third group was. but the kids are really your target audience, right? So the value proposition is, what's the unique thing that you're doing for those kids? The strategy defines your path. And so, we heard about your strategy, and it was very clear and very succinct, right? And then you have your objectives, measures, targets, initiatives, and then the strategy map together that says, okay, if we're delivering this value to these folks and we're doing it this way, here are all of the specific things that we need to be working on. And here is the specific roadmap of how we're going to do that. And then you can come back on a periodic basis, on a quarterly basis or a semi-annual basis and say, okay, how are we doing? Have we put in place the partnerships? Because again, from a strategy map perspective, we need the partnerships in order to get the mentors, in order to serve more kids. Well, if we didn't put the partnerships in place, we probably don't have more mentors, and we're probably having a hard time increasing the number of kids we serve. And so it starts to focus, where do you need to start and what's important? I mean, probably your organization would it's much sexier and more fun to actually be working with the kids than it is to be doing outreach to other organizations, right? But ultimately, that's the way you're going to grow your program. So that's sort of the power of the balanced scorecard, is it helps you really see that whole picture all at once. Next slide. So that is the end of my presentation. Here is my contact information. If you get into this and start working it and have questions or whatever, feel free to get in touch. Are there questions that folks have right now? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up.
Just one quick question. I noticed your arrows all went one way. Is there ever a reason the arrows don't go both ways?
Absolutely. So in the strategy mapping process, there's a whole little process that you use. And yes, the whole idea is the arrows only go one way. And if you find that you want the arrows to go backwards, that tells you got something messed up in there. And typically what you do is you put your objectives into, I'm trying to think if I can, you map your objectives, and if you want to start making them go backwards, sometimes it means that maybe you haven't quite understood, what's infrastructure versus what's business process, and that may mean something moves in terms of perspectives. My view is, if you keep arguing about whether it belongs in this perspective or that perspective, it's not that important which perspective it's in, because it's important. But yes, the arrows should be only one direction, and they should always go up. Now, if you, I'm not sure that I have one that I can get to real quickly to share that shows where I have business process and financial side by side. In that case, an arrow may go sideways from one perspective to the other, but it only goes in one direction, because you're trying to say cause and effect. If I do this, then that happens.
Thank you very much.
And I mean, if you win the lottery, you can put financial on the bottom and say, we got a ton of money, which enables us to hire more people and expand our programs to serve our customers. But the thing that I don't want to see is we didn't get money, and so we weren't able to hire people, and you have to take ownership of the money piece, right? And it may be the fundraising is your most important business process, right? So, other questions? Well, thank you for attending this session. Thank you for your patience with the technology. And as a reminder, the slides are down below and you can download them and enjoy the rest of the conference.